Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We have here in this room one live journalist, but I understand from Dan we have many others, what, about 40 or so? 40 or so who are joining us via Zoom. Welcome to all of you. I want to brief you on the developments that have taken place this morning. I understand very well that the topic we are taking up here, disciplines on fisheries subsidies, is, while it's extremely important, it's also highly complex. And I'd like to encourage you to ask any questions that you may have, and not feel as though these are questions that everyone knows the answer to, because there really are no bad questions ever. And on this particular topic, that's particularly the case. So please feel free to ask any questions. We have a team of very dedicated press officers here who can provide you with background as well during the course of the day. The meeting kicked off this morning at 8 o'clock. We have had more than 50 ministers or heads of delegation. By and large, they were indeed ministers. The agenda was as follows: an opening statement from the Director General, a statement as well of welcome from the General Council Chair, Ambassador Dacio Castillo of Honduras, a report from the negotiating group chair on rules, Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia. And then we had exchanges of the ministers. And as I mentioned, there were more than 50 ministers taking the floor. It was quite an impressive logistical achievement, because we're talking about ministers going all the way to the Pacific, Solomon Islands, etc., Fiji, Papua New Guinea, to the Middle East, to Europe. And while there have been some glitches connecting, by the time I left the room, every minister was able to connect and to speak. We will have a total of 108 delegations speaking during the course of the day. At the end of this meeting, there will be a closing statement from Ambassador Wills, who will, on his own responsibility, give an assessment as to what has happened, and his thoughts on the next steps. And then there'll be a summing up as well from the Director General, Ngozi, who will give her thoughts as well. And then there'll be a closing statement from the DG. We expect to have Director General Ngozi and Ambassador Wills here to give you a press conference at the end of this meeting. We're saying, this is to be confirmed, we're saying around 7 o'clock p.m. Geneva time. That, of course, is subject to the meeting's conclusion, but we went fairly smoothly, even with the technical glitches that came along. I've got Dan handing me this. Am I on the record? Well, since I'm on YouTube, I think I am on the record. Am I correct about that? If I'm being broadcast, I think I have to be on the record. So yes, I am on the record. Now, let me give you some information about what happened today so far. This is the largest gathering of ministers since the 2017 ministerial conference in Buenos Aires. We had, as I mentioned, more than 50 delegations take the floor in this morning's session. The background to this is that these negotiations on disciplines for fisheries subsidies have been underway for 20 years. Since the launch of the Doha Development Agenda in 2001, the objective of these negotiations is to scale back harmful subsidies which lead to overfishing and the depletion of global fish stocks. There are three main categories that are being targeted. One of them is subsidies that go to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. One of them goes to fishing of overfished stocks. And the other, which is possibly the most contentious, is subsidies which lead to overfishing and overcapacity. As I mentioned, these are highly complex talks. The WTO is not a fisheries management organization. So why, you may ask, is the WTO involved in this? The answer is because the WTO has a complex framework of rules which have been used to discipline industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies with some success. In 2015, global leaders from 192 countries agreed in New York to include these negotiations and the objective of disciplining fishery subsidies as part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's Article 14.6 or number 14.6 for those of you scoring at home. Um, Trade ministers in Buenos Aires in 2017 reaffirmed that goal. But we have not hit the target deadline of 2020, obviously, which has increased the urgency of these talks. And this is indeed the reason why the Director General has called this meeting at ministerial level. The talks have been going on for too long. We have missed deadlines, and there is a need for political impetus that can only come from ministers. So the DG said it was time to try something new. She told ministers this morning that she hoped that today's meeting would, quote, provide us the political guidance we need to conclude these negotiations soon, close quote. She also said she was optimistic on reaching a deal for two reasons. And I'm quoting her again. Members all agree on the severity of the problem concerning the depletion of fisheries resources and recognize that solving it is a shared responsibility for all of us. Second, I hear from many members that text-based negotiations are what you want, and we now have a draft text that could serve as a basis for end-stage negotiations. Shifting to full text-based negotiations requires a text to serve as the platform for forging final compromises, close quote. She stressed that this text was a draft, a tool, if you will. It did not represent a final agreement, and elements can be added or subtracted. She added that, quote, success on fishery subsidies would demonstrate to the world that the WTO can deliver new multilateral agreements. It would enhance our prospects for success in other areas, and this is the collective choice facing you today, close quote. The discussions today centered on the responses of ministers to two questions sent by Ambassador Santiago Wills to delegations on the 2nd of July. And those questions were as follows. The first question, do ministers affirm their commitment to conclude the negotiations as soon as possible ahead of the ministerial conference, which is the 30th of November to the 3rd of December? And do ministers confirm that basic landing zones needed for agreement are contained in the existing negotiating text? And are they prepared to authorize their ambassadors and heads of delegation to show greater flexibility with the objective of achieving a final agreement? The second question was, can we agree that the key component of special and differential treatment is for poor and vulnerable artisanal fishers in developing and least developed countries to have the flexibilities that they need? Now, I'm not going to assess the progress of the meeting at this stage. Many important delegations have yet to take the floor, although many have. It's ongoing, and it's very difficult at this point to assess what it is, where exactly we are. These are questions you can pose to the DG and Ambassador Wills later today. But I thought it was important for your background, certainly, to highlight where it is that delegations agree and where they do not agree. So it's important that all delegations acknowledge, as the DG said this morning, that overfishing and depletion of fish stocks is a serious problem. All agree that subsidies for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing should be banned. All members agree that special and differential treatment for developing countries is an important element in the negotiations, and that special and differential treatment must be included in any final deal, and that least developed countries should be accorded maximum flexibilities. Where they disagree is largely on the scope of special and differential treatment and how to strike the right balance between flexibilities for developing countries and ensuring an ambitious outcome on sustainability. Um, the other key area of disagreement is whether a hybrid approach to subsidies, in which subsidies extended by governments would not be subject to disciplines in the subsidizing member if that member can demonstrate that measures are in place which maintain fish stocks at sustainable levels. All members agree that poor and vulnerable artisanal fishers warrant special treatment, but many members said that SDT flexibilities need to be broadened to include small scale fishers and to provide policy space so that governments can develop their fisheries sectors. Members also disagree on whether the scope of the agreement should be extended to so called non specific subsidies involving fuel. Many members have found this to be objectionable. They say these are horizontal subsidies and that they should not be included in a WTO agreement. Let me stop there and I will now take your questions. Let's take a question from Christian Ulrich. Christian, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Keith, and nice to see you. Uh, could you give us, could you put a little bit more beef on the bone and tell us who said what? Did you have statements from the EU, from China, from Japan, from the US? US probably not, but could you just tell us who said what exactly?
No, no, I won't. I won't do that. What I can tell you is that the positions that countries expressed were very much in line with what they've said before. There were some indications of flexibilities. Um, that some delegations were more pleased with the negotiating text than others. Um, but on certain broad concepts, I think people understand that if we're going to get into a more intensive phase of these negotiations, we need a document from which to work. And so we'll see. We heard from a couple of delegations that there may be some new proposals coming in. I would stress that when it comes to Article 5.1.1, which deals with this hybrid approach that I mentioned, whereas the subsidies that countries, mostly developed countries, extend to their fisheries sectors, if they are offset by fish management programs that assure sustainable stocks, that those subsidies would not be disciplined. There were quite a few developing countries that had problems with this because they said it was essentially guaranteeing the status quo, whereby large subsidizers, which are principally not developing countries, would continue to subsidize as they have been. The other side of that is on the question of special and differential treatment. How far do you go? While everyone accepts that poor, vulnerable artisanal fishers and least developed countries should have very broad exemptions, complete carve outs are something that many members expressed discomfort with that idea. So that gives you an idea of where the governments were. I would not say that I saw any delegation indicate a radical shift in its position, but there were subtle indications, which far cleverer people than I, like Ambassador Wills and the DG, have no doubt noted, and which will influence their thinking when it comes to the next steps. So I'll stop. I'll stop there. Oh, you have the floor, please. That easy.
Yes, thank you, Keith. A question about the deadline. Did any country raise the issue that it won't be feasible to reach an agreement until just before the ministerial conference at the end of the year, or did they say that in general it's feasible? Thank you.
In fact, no. No one said that it was not feasible to reach agreement by, we say, ahead of the ministerial conference. And the reason we say that is because we don't know what sort of ministerial conference this will be. If it's completely virtual, then having intensive negotiations will be tricky. And many delegations have expressed unease at the prospect of negotiating virtually. So that's why people are saying, let's get it done before. In fact, a couple of members of APEC who are in time zones that are amenable to an 8 o'clock start here in Geneva, they said that the APEC ministers, I believe there were 21 of them, they are sticking with the idea that this should be completed by the 31st of July. Now, that is not something that the Director General or Ambassador Wills believes will be attainable, but a couple of ministers were very clear that they want the work to continue right up until that point, and let's see what happens. So no one said, no one said that this was not attainable. I see that Hannah Monacan is here. Oh, sorry, we've got a question. But let me ask Hannah first, and then I'll come back to you.
Hi, Keith. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Hannah. Thank you. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks for chatting with us. I just wanted to get a sense of maybe a general overview of kind of which countries have spoken so far. It sounds like mostly based on time zone, like maybe some Asia, some Europe and stuff, but maybe you could just give us a flavor of which countries have spoken. And then would you say that ministers so far are answering the two questions presented by the DG and the chair? And then how many of those answers have been yes or close to yes for both of those questions?
Yes, to your first question, it is based on time zones, and so it's what you're looking at is Pacific Islands, you're looking at Asia, you're looking at Europe, and you're looking at Africa. The responses were nuanced. It's difficult to say in terms of answering the question. Well, some some ministers were more directly to the point than others, but all of them, in one way or another, got around to answering. And I would say that all of them said that there were some problems with the text. That's what you'd expect. It's a negotiating document. All of them said there were areas to the text with which they disagreed. But I didn't hear, I heard people say that some elements of the text were not acceptable, but I didn't hear anyone say that the text itself was unacceptable. And where there were degrees of concern, they were along the lines of what I spoke about earlier. The, the, the breadth and depth of special and differential treatment, and this hybrid approach to subsidies, and whether or not that could be continued, whether or not this would be extended to developing countries as well as developed countries that may not yet have the kinds of fisheries management programs that are suggested by this particular article. So, did anyone give an absolute definitive yes to every element that was posed to them? No. Did some say that they were more pleased with the number of landing zones identified by the text than others? For sure. But I hasten to add that we have many more delegations to take the floor, so we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I would say that that there were, put it this way, there were a few pleasant surprises, and there was nothing that was out there that indicated something that looked to represent a new danger to these talks. This does not mean in any way, shape, or form that we have easy going ahead of us. It's very clear that there will be a lot of hard work still to come. No one is under any illusions that the text that's before them now is going to be the final agreement. So let's wait and see what happened. And these are questions that you might want to pose to the DG and to Santiago later today. I think I have Kazmira over to my left. Kazmira, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, you've answered my question in part, but just more generally, what outcome today would qualify then as a success, especially if a lot of countries are sticking to the stance that they held previously. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the principal objectives of this meeting was to get ministers to delve into the details of these very, very technical talks. Um, and every WTO member has a different orientation on this. I mean, you have Mongolia, which is a landlocked country, and you have the Solomon Islands, which are dependent on fisheries for their livelihoods and for their nutrition. So it's and there are various elements to the text that cause people joy or grief. Um, I think if we come out of this discussion with political guidance and with ministers feeling a little bit more comfortable with the details of these technical talks. They certainly appeared during the course of the discussion to have a mastery of these complex negotiations. Um, and I think that the fact that this meeting was called led them to be engaged. And I didn't hear a single delegation say that they would not be engaged in the process going forward, and that the ministers had not given their heads of delegation, their ambassadors or chiefs of mission, the authority to be engaged in an intensive way in the weeks to come. So to a certain extent, my reading of it right now is those objectives have been attained. What happens in terms of those who know the fine points of this far better than I, whether they see things that might allow the process to advance, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait till we've heard from everyone. But giving political impetus to these talks was a very important objective, and that clearly is being attained right now. Does that answer your question? I have Sarah Ann Arup from Politico. Sarah Ann, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Keith. My question is, first of all, can you maybe tell us a bit more about the pleasant surprises that you mentioned? And then also, are there any major WTO members that are not participating today? You said that there are 108 participants. And if I may, to what extent do countries mention the US's new proposal on forced labor? Thanks.
I didn't hear anyone talk about the US proposal. I don't think I really want to say if any country that did or did not participate would be classified as major or not. All of our members are important. I would say this: 108 is a pretty big number, and I have not gone through the whole list yet, and the Western Hemisphere has not yet started to weigh in. So there'll be more to come, but I would say that the members that you would think of as being instrumental to these talks, I can't think of too many of them that were not participating. So far, and I haven't looked at the whole list because I've only been focusing on those that have spoken up to now. Did I answer your questions, or did I successfully avoid them?
I also had the question about pleasant surprises.
Pleasant surprises. Well, I would say the tone of the meeting. I'd say the tone of the meeting was constructive. There clearly are disagreements among the members. There's no question about that. But I did not detect anything other than a very firm recognition of this problem and an acknowledgement that we need to have an agreement, and that everyone said that they were committed to giving it all they have to try and find a way forward. And that could mean some very long and painful evenings of going line by line through text and trying to find language that is acceptable to the consensus. So I cannot recall a discussion of this issue at ministerial level involving this many ministers. I can't recall that happening. In BA, it certainly didn't happen. There were discussions of it, but not quite like this, where the questions were targeted towards very specific elements of the text, and the responses that came back were detailed and really quite, in terms of their level in terms of the level of expertise shown by ministers on this, I would say it was very impressive. So it's more of a general feeling. I can't point to a specific delegation and say there was a revelation there, but I would say that the tone was very positive. There wasn't a lot of negativity at all, um, although there were some delegations that expressed unhappiness with elements of the text. But I would say that overall the tone was really quite constructive and positive. I have a question coming in now from Ravi Kant. Ravi, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Keith. Actually, I have a couple of questions, at least three.
I'm not surprised. Go ahead.
The very first question is, there are increasing reports that the WTO Secretariat put a lot of pressure on LDCs and some Pacific countries to give favorable responses that would, align with whatever positions that the DG and the chair have said in their two questions. The second question, Keith, is the gross imbalance in those two questions, namely when the very fundamental issue is prohibiting harmful fishery subsidies, which is in the Article 5 of the overcapacity on overfishing pillar. How on earth that specific carve-outs given to the big subsidizers who depleted the global stocks that include EU, US, Japan, Korea, and China in Article 5.5.1.1, and even in 5.2 on, I think this is the issue concerning the European Union's access agreements, and even in 5.3 about
Ravi, can you get to the question?
So the
you have
question
another
is
question
that
too, so
why
it would be good
on
if you could be brief. There are others who have questions.
So the question here is simple, that the real issue is not being focused. The real issue being
Ravi, that's not a question.
No, is that correct or not? Some countries have said in their statements, for example, issues in the the OCOF pillar have not been actually tackled, nor have been asked as a question to be addressed by ministers. Third, the general sense of the text being imbalanced has been echoed by many countries. Do you agree with that?
So for your first question about secretariat pressure, I'm really not aware of that taking place. It'd be pretty unusual for a member of the secretariat to pressure a minister to do anything. So I don't know what that is all about, but I certainly have not seen any evidence of this. As far as I know, neither Dan nor I have been pressuring ministers to go along with anything. That was off the record. With respect to Article 5.1.1, well, it's true. There are a lot of delegations who don't like this hybrid approach that I mentioned in the beginning. It's true. Many of them don't like it. They think that it enables large subsidizers to continue subsidizing if they can demonstrate that they have in place fisheries management systems that promote sustainable stocks. These countries that oppose this say that this is a preservation of the status quo, and they don't like it. The other side of that is on the special and differential treatment. There are some concerns about wholesale carve-outs there as well. So those 2 points, special and differential treatment and this hybrid approach, I would say are really the two key issues where we need to have resolution. Were there those who said that the text was imbalanced? Of course there were. Were there others that said they were imbalanced because they went too far in terms of giving special and differential treatment that was too broad? Yes, there were. This is a negotiation, and I think it's very important to pay attention to those two areas, because they will be key to try and find an agreement. And positions on this are firm. So let's see what the negotiations bring. I think Ambassador Wills has been extremely skillful in charting a course that has brought members together around a consolidated. Remember, for more than 17, 18 years, there was no consolidated document. There were just a rash of proposals that were out there floating around. I have to avoid fish metaphors as much as I can, and so far I've done well. But there were a large number of these proposals out there without any kind of central focus or theme. Without a text, you don't have a negotiation. And without a negotiation, we're not going to address the problem, and soon we won't have any fish. So I think people understand that there needs to be a lot of hard work ahead of them if they're going to resolve these two very thorny issues, because they're critically important to all of our members. Let me now give the floor to Peter Ungfakorn. Peter, you have the floor.
Hi, Keith. I have just one question. It would be very unusual.
Thank you, Peter.
It would be very unusual for ministers in a big meeting, a plenary type meeting like this, to actually indicate significant movement. It very rarely happens. But this virtual meeting is also different from other ministerials in that it's virtual, whereas if they were all here or in some place together, there would be opportunities for them to meet in small groups or even in the dreaded green room. So the question is, are there any arrangements today for ministers to be able to meet in small groups?
Peter, you're absolutely right. The fact that this meeting, you're right. You're not going to see in a big meeting like this wholesale changes of position. Somebody, I think it might have been, was it Hannah or Sarah Ann, who said, "What bright spots did I see?" There was one interesting thing that people mentioned, a number of delegation mentioned about this hybrid approach, this Article 5.1.1. And they said that this particular issue, this particular formulation in the text was not acceptable to them, absent, and a number of them said this, mechanisms which would lead to those subsidies being reduced over time. And I had not heard that before. Is Jessica here? Have you heard that before, Jessica? Kind of, she says. Yeah, I thought, for me, that was new. That was something that I thought was quite interesting. But yes, there is no opportunity for ministers to huddle together, to do horse trading or anything like that in this virtual atmosphere. And this is why at the ministerial conference at the end of the year, people have said if the meeting is going to be 100% virtual, we shouldn't expect it to be a heated negotiating session. The DG said very clearly in the beginning that even if ministers came to Geneva, they would not be permitted to sit in the council room because they didn't want to give the impression that some ministers were given an advantage over others. So all ministers participated virtually. Ambassadors took their seats, and in some instances, they spoke on behalf of their ministers. But it was all of the ministers that took the floor did so virtually. So just to have them together and participating in this way was in and of itself something of a triumph. And I have to say, people were holding their breath in the beginning when they went to ministers in far-flung parts of the world. But as I said, at least at the time that I left, when over 50 ministers had taken the floor and there were only one or two still to speak, there were no ministers who did not get the opportunity. They may not have been able to establish the connection right away, but eventually all of them were able to take the floor. So I think that was impressive. I don't know whether they're going to be able to resolve the question of the width and breadth of special and differential treatment or the hybrid approach in a virtual way, but I've been surprised before. Now I'd like to give the floor to Chris Horseman from Borderlex. Chris, you have the floor, please.
Hi, Keith. Thank you. Yes, from what you have seen so far, I wonder whether it is your view that we're heading towards a situation where the references to fuel subsidies are going to have to be taken out of the text in order to secure an agreement. To what extent do you think that's a fair comment?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but what I can say is there were a large number of countries that took the floor today that said they have a real problem with this sort of non-specific subsidy. And what that means is that it's not a subsidy that is specifically directed to the industry itself, i.e., the fisheries industry, but is accorded more broadly to a variety of industries and or consumers. Um, a number of delegations said that because this is a non-specific subsidy, it should not be subject to WTO disciplines, and the scope of the agreement should not include this. So whether the opposition to it was such that it will result in a change to the text, I don't know. But you should be aware that there was some strong opposition expressed towards this. The next question I would take would be from John Zarakostas. John, you have the floor, please.
Yes, good afternoon, Keith. Perhaps you can give us a bit of a readout on what the coastal states in West Africa have said about this, and also some of the Pacific Island states. I'd be interested. And also if there have been any interventions about fish stock management by any of the delegations, given that some species travel thousands of miles. So who's responsible for the fish management of, say, bluefin tuna? And secondly, on the question of various prohibited subsidies, have any ministers spoken about prohibiting certain types of fishing methods like drift netting?
To answer your last question, I didn't hear anyone say anything about drift netting, no. I don't want to generalize about all of the statements coming from all of the Pacific Islands and the African coastal states, because there's a lot of them, and they were not identical positions. But all of them did say one thing, which is that fisheries is extremely important to them from a livelihood as well as a nutritional standpoint, and that an agreement is absolutely essential. They were very, I would say they were extremely strong on that. With respect to the fish management proposals, I think there's a lot of different elements to this. Some developing countries said that they were concerned that some of the reporting, some of the transparency or notification requirements being asked of them would be too onerous, that they did not have the technical capacity to be able to have a management regime in place that was on par with those in some of the more developed countries. There were also some delegations who said that they did not think it was the role of the WTO to be involved in fish management, that we're not a fish management organization and we shouldn't be involved in this, that the authority for fish management rests with the coastal states themselves. And I think that this is something that is widely accepted. Certainly, the fact that we don't have the expertise in this area is evident. It's clear. We've acknowledged this. That's why we've had a number of other organizations, not least the Food and Agriculture Organization, helping us. They have the data. They can provide us with guidance of a technical nature that we don't possess. What we have is the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, and nobody else has that. So, it's a real challenge, and we've had to work closely with sister agencies, and I think that's going quite well. And it may also be something that we look to in the future when we talk about technical assistance and capacity building. So I hope that answered your question. Let me take one more question from Christian Ulrich, and then we'll see you at 7, I hope.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. This is on special and differential treatment. Since China has by far the biggest fishing fleet in the world, maybe we can mention this name for once now. Have there been any demands or assurances that China would not claim any special and differential treatment? Demands or assurances? Thank you.
No one specifically asked that question. I would say that what China said is what I've heard China say many other times, that they will take on obligations commensurate with their level of development. I did not hear anyone specifically point fingers to any specific country or member. What they did say, they referred regularly to large subsidizers, and the fact that in many parts of the world, the Pacific, Africa, Latin America, you have members, you have countries for which fisheries are extremely important, but which do not subsidize their fleets. Specifically, they don't subsidize deep water industrial fleets. So there were a number of members that said these are the countries that must make the biggest contribution, but they did not specifically mention any names. So with that, I will thank you all for your participation and for your patience. It will be a long day. I hope that we're back here by 7, but that's to be confirmed. So one way or the other, we'll keep you all posted on what is going on. Thank you very much.